The law offices of Brennan, Whitmore and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan high-rise that seemed designed to intimidate before you even crossed the threshold. Everything about it screamed old money and older secrets. Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Oil paintings of stern-faced men who'd probably foreclosed on widows for sport. And a silence so thick you could hear your own heartbeat. I sat in the waiting room, watching the September rain streak down windows that offered a view of Central Park that real estate agents would kill for, and wondered for the 100th time why I'd even bothered to come. My name is Benjamin Parker. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a high school history teacher in Burlington, Vermont. Not exactly the career path expected of a Parker. My family had been titans of industry for 4 generations, building an empire that started with shipping in the 1890s and evolved into a conglomerate that touched everything from real estate to defense contracts. But I'd walked away from all that at 22, choosing chalk dust and lesson plans over boardrooms and blood money. The family had never forgiven me for it, and sitting in those lawyers' offices 14 years later, I was about to find out if that choice would cost me everything or save me from something worse. Mr. Parker? A secretary who looked like she'd been carved from marble and dressed by Versace gestured toward a conference room. Mr. Whitmore is ready for the family now. I followed my father and brother into the room, noting how they walked like they owned the place, which, knowing Richard Parker Sr., they probably had a stake in it somewhere. My father had never met a business he couldn't buy into or a person he couldn't purchase. At 71, he moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent 50 years getting exactly what he wanted. When he wanted it, consequences be damned. His silver hair was still thick, his gray suit impeccable, his presence commanding in a way that made strong men stammer and weak men cower. My brother, Richard Jr., though everyone called him Rick to distinguish him from our father, was a carbon copy 30 years younger. Same sharp features that looked calculating rather than intelligent. Same cold blue eyes that saw profit margins before people. Same $10,000 suit that somehow made him look cheaper than my off-the-rack blazer from Target. He was checking his phone as we walked, probably monitoring stock prices or mistress texts with equal dispassion. Benjamin, my father acknowledged, his tone suggesting he'd just noticed something unpleasant on his shoe. I'm surprised you could get time off from your teaching. The pause before teaching was deliberate, a verbal sneer that managed to convey his complete contempt for my profession without saying anything actionable. Richard Parker Sr. was a master of the implicit insult, the deniable disparagement. It's Saturday, Dad, I said mildly. Even teachers get weekends. If you say so. He turned away, dismissing me as efficiently as he'd dismissed every life choice I'd made that didn't involve the family business. To Richard Parker Sr., teaching was what people did when they couldn't do anything important. That I'd chosen it over a corner office at Parker Industries was a betrayal he'd never forgiven and never would. Nice suit, Benji, Rick added, not looking up from his phone. Very practical. Did you get it at one of those teacher discount stores? It's Benjamin, I corrected, though I knew he'd keep using the childhood nickname just to needle me. And yes, some of us have to shop within our means. Must be tough, he said with false sympathy. Living on a teacher's salary when you could have had all this. He gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. But hey, at least you're shaping young minds or whatever it is you tell yourself to sleep at night. Harold Whitmore entered before I could respond, moving with the gravity of a man about to perform last rites. He'd been my grandfather's lawyer for 40 years, keeper of secrets and architect of estates. His face was professionally neutral, but I thought I caught a glimmer of something. Amusement? Anticipation. In his eyes as he set a mahogany box on the conference table. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. As you know, we're here to execute the last will and testament of Theodore Parker, who passed on the 15th of August. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Before we begin, I should note that Mr. Parker made several amendments to his will in the months before his death. The document I'll be reading today was finalized just 6 weeks ago. I saw my father's jaw tighten imperceptibly. Changes to the will meant Grandpa Ted had been thinking, planning, preparing something none of us expected. In the Parker family, surprises were rarely pleasant and never accidental. "Let's not drag this out," Rick said, his Patek Philippe catching the light as he gestured impatiently. "We all know what's coming. The old man had his fun playing favorites, but the company stays in the family. Just tell us the percentages so we can get on with the transition." Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he was enjoying this more than professional ethics should allow. "Very well. Though I should mention that Mr. Parker was quite specific about the order in which his bequests should be revealed. He felt it was important for context." "Context?" my father repeated, the words sounding like profanity in his mouth. "Theodore never did anything without an agenda. What game is he playing now?" "Perhaps we should begin to find out," Whitmore suggested. "Let's start with the minor bequests." The list was long but predictable. Donations to charities Grandpa had supported, mostly educational institutions and veterans organizations. Generous gifts to longtime employees, his driver of 30 years, his housekeeper, his personal secretary who'd kept his secrets and his calendar with equal discretion. A few million here, a few million there, the kind of casual wealth distribution that barely dented the Parker fortune. I half listened, my mind wandering to Grandpa Ted and our complicated relationship. He'd been the only one who hadn't completely written me off when I'd refused to join the family business. While my father raged about wasted potential and my brother sneered about teaching being a job for people who couldn't do, Grandpa had simply nodded and said, "A man's got to follow his own path, even if it leads away from the family table." We'd stayed in touch over the years, birthday cards with handwritten notes, occasional lunches when I was in the city for teaching conferences, long conversations about history and human nature that had nothing to do with stock prices or acquisition strategies. He'd been particularly interested in my lessons on the robber barons of the Gilded Age, asking pointed questions about how I taught the balance between innovation and exploitation. "Interesting that you bring up Carnegie," he'd said during our last lunch, 6 months before his death. "A man who built an empire on the backs of workers, then spent his twilight years trying to buy his way into heaven with libraries. Do you think it worked?" "I think guilt is a powerful motivator," I'd replied. "But philanthropy doesn't erase exploitation. It just puts a prettier face on it." He'd smiled at that, a sad, knowing expression. "You always were too smart for your own good, Benjamin, and too honest for this family." "Now," Whitmore continued, pulling me back to the present, "we come to the more substantial distributions. To my son, Richard Parker Sr., and my grandson, Richard Parker Jr., I leave the bulk of my estate to be divided equally between them. This includes all holdings in Parker Industries, the real estate portfolio, the domestic and international investment accounts, and liquid assets totaling approximately $150 million. The number hung in the air like a declaration of war. 150 million. Split 2 ways, it was 75 million each, more money than most people could conceive of, let alone spend. I watched my father and brother exchange satisfied looks, already calculating their expanded empires. "However," Whitmore added, and that single word changed the atmospheric pressure in the room, "this bequest comes with specific and binding conditions." Conditions? My father's voice could have frozen hellfire. What conditions? Theodore had no right to. Mr. Parker had every right to distribute his estate as he saw fit. Whitmore interrupted smoothly. "The conditions are quite specific and..." I should note legally enforceable. Violation of any condition results in immediate and complete forfeiture of the inheritance. This is ridiculous, Rick sputtered. What kind of conditions? I'll detail those momentarily. First, there's one more bequest to address. Whitmore turned to me, and I swear I saw sympathy in his eyes. To my grandson, Benjamin Parker, I leave the cabin. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the rain against the windows, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the sound of my brother's breathing as it shifted from normal to barely suppressed laughter. Then Rick exploded. The cabin? That rundown shack in the Adirondacks? That's it. He was practically wheezing with mirth. Oh, this is perfect. This is just absolutely perfect. The family disappointment gets the family embarrassment. What's next? The contents of his junk drawer. It's fitting, my father added, his smile sharp as a surgical scalpel. A useless property for a useless grandson. At least Theodore had a sense of humor about failure. I kept my face neutral, but inside, something twisted and burned. The cabin had been Grandpa's retreat, the place he went when the weight of the Parker name got too heavy. I'd spent summers there as a kid, before the family divide became too wide to bridge. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, no electricity, barely any insulation, but it had been our place, mine and Grandpa's, where we could talk without the shadow of Parker Industries looming over every word. I remembered the last summer I'd spent there, the summer before college when I told him I was planning to major in education instead of business. They'll never forgive you, he'd warned, sitting on the porch as sunset painted the mountains gold. Your father sees anything outside the company as betrayal. Rick sees it as weakness. They'll cut you off, financially and emotionally. I know, I'd said, but I can't spend my life building something I don't believe in. I can't pretend that what Parker Industries does is just business when I know what really pays for our fortune. He'd been quiet for a long time after that. Then, you're stronger than I was at your age. I told myself I'd change things from the inside, make the company better, cleaner. Instead, the company changed me, made me complicit in things that, well, things that keep old men awake at night. Is that all? I asked Whitmore quietly, pushing the memory aside. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. The deed will be transferred to your name immediately. There are also some personal effects at the cabin that your grandfather specifically wanted you to have. He was quite insistent that you be the one to go through them. Personal effects, Rick mocked, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Probably his collection of fishing lures and moth-eaten flannel shirts. Hope you've got room in your teacher's apartment for all that treasure, Benji. Maybe you can sell them on eBay. Supplement that generous educator's income. The cabin does come with the surrounding 40 acres, Whitmore added mildly, and mineral rights for what that's worth in that area. 40 acres of worthless mountain land. My father dismissed. Probably can't even get a cell signal, though I suppose that's fitting. Benjamin always did prefer living in the past. Now, about those conditions, Whitmore continued, ignoring the interruption. Mr. Parker was very specific. The inheritance is contingent upon both Richard Sr. and Richard Jr. maintaining what he termed ethical business practices for a period of 10 years. Any violation of federal law, any conviction for financial crimes, any verified instances of bribery, corruption, or... He paused, reading directly from the document. The kinds of activities that built this fortune in the first place will result in immediate forfeiture. My father's face had progressed from red to purple to a color I didn't think existed in nature. That's impossible. Business requires flexibility. Theodore knew that better than anyone. He built this company by doing things he apparently regretted, Whitmore finished. Furthermore, The conditions specify that Parker Industries must maintain current employment levels, honor all pension obligations, and submit to annual independent audits by a firm of the trustees' choosing. Who are these trustees? Rick demanded. Who's going to be watching over our shoulders like we're children? I am one, Whitmore said calmly. The others prefer to remain anonymous for now. But I assure you, we take our responsibilities seriously. Mr. Parker was very concerned about the future of his company and wanted to ensure it remained true to what he called the principles I abandoned too easily. Principles. My father spat the word like it tasted rotten. The old man built this company by crushing competitors and exploiting workers. He bribed judges, bought politicians, broke strikes with violence. Now he wants to lecture us about ethics from beyond the grave. Perhaps, Whitmore said quietly, he wanted better for the next generation. Perhaps he hoped his grandsons would be better men than he was. Better men don't build empires, Rick shot back. They teach high school and live in one-bedroom apartments and pretend they're noble instead of just poor. I let the insult wash over me. I'd heard worse from both of them, and frankly, Rick's opinion of my life mattered about as much as a snowflake in hell. But something about this whole setup felt wrong. Grandpa Ted had never been one for simple gestures. Everything he did had layers, purposes within purposes. The meeting devolved into arguments about legal challenges and loopholes. My father and brother united in their outrage at being constrained by a dead man's conscience. They threw around words like undue influence and mental capacity, threatened to tie up the estate in court for years. Whitmore weathered it all with professional calm. You're welcome to challenge the will, he said. Of course, Mr. Parker anticipated that possibility. Should you contest any portion of the will, your entire inheritance is immediately placed in trust, with the trustees having full discretion over any distributions. You would receive an allowance, generous by most standards, perhaps less so by yours, but no control over the principal. He thought of everything, my father said bitterly. He had time to plan, Whitmore agreed, and excellent legal advice. I slipped out while they were deep in discussion about their options, leaving them to their millions and their conditions. The secretary gave me a small smile as I passed. Sympathy or schadenfreude? I couldn't tell. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the street. Manhattan after rain always looked freshly washed, like the city was pretending it could be clean if it tried hard enough. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of wet concrete and ambition, and thought about Grandpa Ted. He'd played his last card from beyond the grave, trying to force ethics on men who'd sold their souls so long ago they'd forgotten they ever had them. But the cabin. Why just the cabin? It wasn't worthless. Land in the Adirondacks had value, especially 40 acres with lake access. But compared to 150 million, it was pocket change. A final insult? A last reminder that I'd chosen poverty over power? Or something else entirely? I'd driven up from Burlington that morning, expecting nothing from the will reading but wanting to pay my respects to the complicated man who'd been the closest thing to a father figure I'd had. Now I sat in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, traffic crawling on the FDR Drive, and wondered what game my grandfather was playing. My phone buzzed. A text from my girlfriend, Sarah, who taught art at the same school. How did it go? Are you okay? I thought about how to answer that. I inherited a cabin. My father and brother split $150 million. They think I'm the loser in this scenario. But you don't. Sarah knew me too well. I don't know what I think. Grandpa was complicated. This feels like more than it seems. Most things are. Drive safe. Wine and Chinese food when you get home. Sounds perfect. But I wasn't going home. Not yet. The cabin was only 3 hours north, 4 with traffic. Whatever Grandpa had left there, whatever personal effects, he'd been so insistent I find, I needed to know. The drive gave me time to think, to remember. Theodore Parker had been a contradiction my whole life. The ruthless businessman who read me bedtime stories. The union buster who taught me to fish with handmade lures. The man who'd built a fortune on others' misery but seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about justice and history. "Tell me about the robber barons," he'd said during one of our last conversations. "How do you teach that unit? Do you tell your students they were heroes or villains?" "I tell them they were both," I'd answered. "Men who built incredible things but left destruction in their wake." I try to help them understand that progress and exploitation often go hand in hand, that the same drive that builds railroads can destroy communities. "And if one of those robber barons realized what he'd done?" Grandpa had asked. "If he wanted to make amends, what would you tell him?" "I'd tell him that you can't undo the past," I'd said. "But you can try to influence the future. You can use what you've built to build something better." He'd smiled sadly. "From your mouth to God's ears, Benjamin. From your mouth to God's ears." The roads got progressively worse as I headed into the mountains. From highway to two-lane blacktop to the dirt track that my Honda definitely wasn't designed for. By the time I reached the cabin, it was past 4 in the afternoon and my car was making sounds that suggested an expensive repair bill in my future. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, which is to say it looked like it was one strong wind away from collapse. Cedar shingles weathered to gray, windows clouded with decades of seasons, a front porch that sagged like an old man's smile. But the door was solid. The lock still worked with the key I'd kept all these years, and inside, it smelled like pine and memory and something else. Cigarette smoke? But Grandpa had quit 20 years ago. Everything was covered in dust but otherwise undisturbed. The stone fireplace where Grandpa had taught me to build a proper fire, explaining the architecture of combustion with the same precision he'd used to explain corporate takeovers. The kitchen table where we'd played cards by lamplight, him teaching me poker and probability while telling stories about the old days. The bookshelf packed with history texts and adventure novels, escape routes from a world that demanded too much and gave too little back. But there were signs of recent presence. A coffee mug in the sink, rinsed but not washed. A stack of legal pads on the table, covered in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. A half-empty pack of cigarettes, so he had started again probably after his diagnosis. I started with the obvious places. Closets, drawers, under the beds. Nothing but the expected detritus of a rarely used vacation home. Mouse droppings and dead flies, blankets that smelled of mildew, canned goods that had expired during the previous administration. But I knew my grandfather. He'd been a man of layers, of hidden depths. A man who'd built a fortune on knowing where to look when others saw only surfaces. If he'd left something for me, it wouldn't be sitting in plain sight. I sat at the kitchen table, looking at the legal pads. Pages and pages of writing, but not random thoughts. Lists, names, dates, amounts. Companies I recognized and others I didn't. Offshore accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland. Shell corporations with innocuous names that appeared over and over. One page caught my eye. At the top, in bold letters, "For Benjamin, the real Parker legacy." Below it, a list that made my blood run cold. Jacobson Construction, 1962. Brooklyn, 3 dead. Teamsters Local 847 to 1968. Newark, arrangement with Torino family. Judge Harrison, 1971 to 1989, $50,000 monthly. Senator Blackwood, 1975 to 1995, votes on defense contracts. Mercy Hospital, 1982, toxic waste disposal under pediatric ward. Project Greenlight, 1991 to 2001, CIA rendition flights. The list went on for pages. Crimes, bribes, cover-ups. The real history of Parker Industries, written in my grandfather's own hand. At the bottom of the last page, a note. The evidence is where we caught our first fish. You'll know what to do. I sat back, my hands shaking. Our first fish. I'd been 7, frustrated because I couldn't get the hang of casting. Grandpa had taken me to a special spot on the lake, a hidden cove where an old oak tree hung over the water. Sometimes, he'd said, the best things are hidden in plain sight. You just have to know where to look. It was nearly dark by the time I reached the cove. The oak was still there, massive and gnarled, its roots creating a natural shelter at the water's edge. I'd need tools to dig, but first I wanted to see if I was even in the right place. That's when I noticed the carving on the tree. Fresh, maybe a few months old. My initials BJP, and below them, an arrow pointing down. I went back to the cabin for a shovel and flashlight. By the time I returned, full dark had fallen, and the woods felt alive with watching eyes. Probably just deer and raccoons, but my paranoia was in overdrive. If even half of what I'd read was true, there were people who'd kill to keep these secrets buried. I dug where the arrow pointed, the work harder than I'd expected. Teaching had kept me in decent shape, but I wasn't used to manual labor. After an hour of digging, my shovel hit something hard. Metal. A lockbox, military surplus, from the look of it, waterproof and built to last. The combination was my birthday. Grandpa never had been creative with passwords. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was everything. Documents, photos, recordings on old cassette tapes and newer digital drives. Financial records going back 60 years. And a letter addressed to me in Grandpa's shaking handwriting. I sat there in the dirt, reading by flashlight while mosquitoes made a feast of me. Benjamin, if you're reading this, then you found what I couldn't bring myself to destroy and couldn't bear to leave discovered by accident. This is the true Parker legacy, not the money or the companies or the reputation, but the crimes that paid for it all. I tell myself I was a different man when I started, that I did what I had to do to survive, to build something from nothing in a world that didn't give second chances. But somewhere along the way, survival became success, and success became an addiction that demanded ever higher prices. By the time I realized what we'd become, I was in too deep to stop. The machine had grown too big, had too many moving parts that would grind to dust anyone who tried to halt them. Your father took to it naturally. He never had the qualms I did. Born without a conscience, that one, though I suppose I'm to blame for that too. And Rick is worse. He doesn't just accept the evil, he revels in it. Calls it disruption and creative destruction, like new words can mask old sins. I've watched them become monsters, and I know I'm the Dr. Frankenstein of this story. But you walked away. At 22, you saw what we were and chose to be something else. When you told me you wanted to teach, to shape minds instead of breaking backs, I was angry at first. Saw it as rejection, weakness. But over the years, I've watched you build a life of meaning instead of money. And it's the only thing that's given me hope in these final months. So I leave you this truth and with it a choice. Everything in this box is evidence. Enough to destroy Parker Industries, to send your father and brother to prison for the rest of their lives, to end the empire I built on innocent blood. The authorities would be very interested in these documents. Some of the crimes have no statute of limitations. Or you can burn it all. Let the dead stay buried. Let your father and Rick have their millions and their conditions. Oh yes, the conditions are real, though they'll find ways around them soon enough. Men like them always do. Walk away as you did before, and live your clean life teaching clean children in your clean little town. I won't tell you what to do. I forfeited that right long ago. But know this, whatever you choose, I'm proud of you. Proud that one Parker managed to keep his soul. Proud that my legacy includes at least one good man, even if I had to drive him away to keep him that way. There's also a smaller envelope in the box. That's for you personally. A little something to make your life easier, whether you choose justice or mercy. You've lived honestly, which in this family makes you a unicorn. Let an old man's guilt ease your path a little. I'm sorry, Benjamin. Sorry for what I built. Sorry for what I allowed. Sorry for the grandfather I could have been if I'd been a better man. But mostly I'm sorry that I'm leaving you with this choice. It should have been mine to make, but I'm a coward even now, even dying. I can't pull the trigger on my own empire. But maybe you can. Maybe you're the Parker who can finally do the right thing. All my love, Theodore. I read the letter 3 times, sitting there in the dark with mosquitoes whining around my head and the weight of 3 generations of sins in my lap. Then I opened the smaller envelope. Bearer bonds. Untraceable, old school, worth about $2 million. Enough to transform my teacher's life without raising questions. Enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, maybe even start a family without worrying about making ends meet. Grandpa's final gift to the grandson who'd chosen poverty over complicity. But it was the choice that paralyzed me. Destroy my family or let them continue destroying others. Send my father and brother to prison or let their victims pile up in silence. I thought about my students. Bright-eyed kids who still believed the world made sense, that hard work and honesty could get you somewhere. I taught them history, the rise and fall of empires, the choices that shaped nations, the moments when individuals stood at crossroads and decided the future with their actions. What would I tell them if they asked what I'd done with this moment? I sat there until dawn, reading through the evidence by flashlight. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. The construction worker deaths weren't accidents. They were murders. Men who'd threatened to expose safety violations. The toxic waste under the hospital had caused a cluster of childhood cancers that Parker Industries had paid millions to keep quiet. The CIA flights had carried prisoners to black sites where interrogation meant torture and most never came back. And through it all, the Parker fortune had grown. Blood money compounding into more blood money, a generational wealth built on generational suffering. By the time the sun rose over the mountains, I'd made my decision. Or rather, the decision had made itself. Because there was only one choice, really. There had only ever been one choice for someone who stood in front of teenagers every day and tried to teach them about justice and courage and doing the right thing even when it cost you everything. I couldn't be judge and jury. Couldn't decide who deserved punishment and who deserved mercy. But I also couldn't let the crimes continue. Couldn't teach about integrity while practicing cowardice. So I found a middle way, though Grandpa probably would have called it the coward's way. I spent the next 3 days in that cabin, organizing everything. Making copies, digital and physical. Creating an index that would make sense to investigators. Writing a detailed summary that connected the dots between crimes spanning 60 years. Then I divided it all up. The FBI would get the federal crimes, the bribery, the CIA connections, the interstate corruption. The New York Attorney General would get the state crimes, the murders, the toxic dumping, the construction deaths. The IRS would get the financial crimes, decades of tax evasion through offshore accounts. The press would get enough to ensure the investigations couldn't be buried. I sent it all anonymously from different locations, using techniques I'd learned from teaching students about the Pentagon Papers and WikiLeaks. Enough to start investigations, but not so much that it would overwhelm them. Let the professionals sort out what was actionable and what was ancient history. The originals went back in the box, which I reburied with improvements. Concrete this time, reinforced and weatherproofed. Evidence had a way of disappearing when Parkers were involved. But this would last. Coordinates carefully noted, just in case. The bearer bonds I struggled with. $2 million. Sarah and I could get married without worrying about money. Could have kids without wondering how we'd pay for college. Could take vacations that didn't involve camping because it was all we could afford. But it was blood money. Every dollar representing someone's pain, someone's loss. How could I use it for happiness when it had caused so much misery? In the end, I kept half and donated half. $1 million to funds for victims, families of construction workers killed in accidents, children who developed cancer from toxic waste, communities destroyed by Parker Industries' expansion, anonymous donations that would never be traced back to me. The other $1 million I kept, but not for luxury, for security, for the inevitable moment when my family discovered what I'd done and came for revenge, for lawyers and protection and the ability to disappear if necessary. Blood money transformed into shield money, which felt like a kind of justice. I drove back to Burlington on Tuesday night, arriving just in time to prep Wednesday's lessons on the fall of Rome. Appropriate, considering I'd just set in motion the fall of my own family's empire. But Rome had been built on conquest and slavery too, and eventually the bill always came due. The barbarians at the gates were just history's way of balancing the books. Sarah knew something had happened the moment I walked in. We'd been together 3 years, living together for one, and she could read me like one of her art history books. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, abandoning her lesson plans. "Several," I admitted. "Generations of them." I told her everything. Sat at our small kitchen table in our rented apartment and laid out the whole ugly truth. The crimes, the evidence, the choice I'd made. She listened without interrupting, her face cycling through shock, horror, and finally, a kind of grim understanding. "They'll know it was you," she said when I finished. "When the investigations start, they'll know. Probably. They'll come after you. Your father doesn't seem like the forgiving type." "No, he's not." She was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "You did the right thing. You know that, right? Those people, those victims. They deserve justice. Do they? Or am I just destroying my family to feel righteous?" "Your family destroyed themselves," she said firmly. "Every signature on those documents, every bribe paid, every crime covered up, those were choices they made. You're just stopping them from making more. It doesn't feel that simple. The right thing rarely does." The first news stories appeared 2 weeks later. Federal investigators raiding Parker Industries offices in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Accounts frozen pending investigation. Stock price plummeting as investors fled what was clearly a sinking ship. My phone exploded with calls I didn't answer. My father's number appeared so often it seemed like a threat. Rick left increasingly unhinged voicemails that progressed from confusion to rage to promises of retribution. Finally, a text from my mother, who'd been silent for 14 years since I'd betrayed the family by becoming a teacher. "You've killed him. I hope you're satisfied." I called her back, my first direct contact with her in over a decade. "He's not dead," I said when she answered. "He might as well be," she hissed. "Everything he built, everything he worked for, destroyed. By his own son. He destroyed it himself, Mom. Every crime, every bribe, every body. That was his choice." "You don't understand business," she said, the old dismissal still sharp after all these years. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices." "Murder isn't a hard choice," I interrupted. "It's a wrong choice. Poisoning children isn't business, it's evil. And you knew. Don't pretend you didn't know." She hung up. We haven't spoken since. The investigations took months. Most of the recent crimes stuck: financial fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, ongoing conspiracies that reached into the present day. The older stuff, the murders and mob connections from the 60s and 70s, proved harder to prosecute. But it was enough. More than enough. Parker Industries collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Assets seized, contracts voided, the Parker name becoming synonymous with corruption on a scale that made Enron look like a jaywalking ticket. The media had a field day with the dynasty's fall, especially the detail about the teacher's son who'd walked away from it all. They never proved it was me who'd leaked the documents, though everyone knew. I became the Parker who'd burned down the castle to save the village, though whether I was hero or traitor depended on who you asked. My father's first heart attack came during the initial raid. The second, fatal one hit during his trial, as a prosecutor detailed the children who died from cancer caused by Parker Industries' illegal waste disposal. He died unrepentant, claiming to the end that he'd done nothing wrong, that business was war and casualties were inevitable. At least he died believing his own lies. That's more peace than his victims got. Rick got 25 to life, though he'd probably serve 15 with good behavior. The money, the power, the golden boy status all evaporated the moment the handcuffs clicked. His wife divorced him before the trial ended, taking the kids and what little money wasn't seized. He writes me from prison sometimes, letters full of rage and blame and promises of revenge when he gets out. I keep them, just in case, but I don't read them anymore. His words are as poisonous as the waste his company dumped. My mother retreated to what the government left her, a modest house in Connecticut, a small trust fund that predated the criminal enterprise. She tells people her husband died of stress and her sons are estranged. Easier than explaining that one son destroyed the family empire and the other helped build it on corpses. I kept teaching, kept living my small life in my small apartment in my small city. The story made national news, but after the initial flurry, I became yesterday's headlines. Just another teacher grading papers and planning lessons, invisible in my ordinariness. But I wasn't unchanged. How could I be? I'd held my family's sins in my hands and chosen to let strangers judge them. I'd destroyed an empire with manila envelopes and postal stamps. I'd proven that sometimes the powerless could topple the powerful, that truth could override wealth, that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. My students noticed a difference, though they couldn't name it. My lessons on moral courage carried more weight. My discussions of historical choices resonated with personal experience. When I taught about individuals who'd stood against corruption, who'd chosen principle over profit, I wasn't just reciting from textbooks. I was teaching what I'd lived. Mr. Parker, one student asked during a discussion of whistleblowers in history, "Do you think it's worth it? Losing everything to do the right thing?" I thought about the cabin in the mountains, now truly mine with no strings attached. About the family I'd lost and the integrity I'd kept. About the victims who'd finally gotten justice and the criminals who'd finally faced consequences. I think, I said carefully, that losing everything external is sometimes the only way to keep everything internal. And in the end, which would you rather live with, poverty and peace, or wealth and complicity? The student, bright kid, probably heading for the Ivy League, nodded thoughtfully. But what if it's your own family you're betraying? Then you have to ask yourself, are you betraying them, or are you stopping them from betraying themselves? Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses. After class, Helen Reeves, who taught English next door, stopped me in the hallway. "Powerful lesson," she said. "Personal experience?" I'd managed to keep my connection to the Parker scandal quiet at school, but Helen was perceptive. Too perceptive. "Something like that," I admitted. "Want to talk about it? Maybe over coffee? Real coffee. Not the swamp water they serve in the teacher's lounge." I looked at her, really looked. Kind eyes, gentle smile, the sort of person who read student essays like they were literature and meant it when she said every kid had potential. Sarah and I had broken up 6 months earlier, the stress of everything proving too much for a relationship that had been built on normal problems and normal solutions. "Maybe," I said, "it's complicated. The best stories usually are." she said. I'll be here when you're ready. That was a year ago. Helen and I have been dating for 8 months now, and she knows everything. Knows who I really am, what I really did, why I sometimes wake up at night wondering if I'm the hero or villain of my own story. She reads the prison letters Rick sends and helps me file them. She holds me when the weight of destroying my own family gets too heavy. She reminds me that I saved more people than I hurt, even if the hurt ones share my last name. The cabin is my retreat now, fixed up with some of the money Grandpa left me. New roof, insulation, solar panels for basic electricity. Internet, because even retreats need connection to the world. It's become my thinking place, where I go to process the past and plan the future. I've written a book there, not about the crimes, those are public record now, but about the choice. About growing up in a family that normalized evil, about the slow realization that success could be built on suffering, about the moment when you have to decide whether to be complicit or courageous. Legacy of Ashes. A Teacher's Choice comes out next month. Small publisher, probably won't make any bestseller lists, but that's not the point. The point is the teenager somewhere who might read it and realize they don't have to follow their family into darkness. The point is the record, the testimony, the proof that you can choose differently. Some of my students have already read advance copies, Perks of Having Your Teacher Be an Author. Their discussions have been intense, thoughtful, sometimes painful. But he lost everything, one student argued. His family, his inheritance, his whole world. Did he, though? Another countered. He kept his integrity. He can sleep at night. He can look at himself in the mirror. What's that worth? Plus, a third added, he got a cool cabin and a girlfriend who accepts his past. That's not nothing. They laughed at that, but they weren't wrong. I did get the cabin and Helen and the ability to teach without hypocrisy. I got the freedom that comes from choosing conscience over cash, justice over generational wealth. And in the end, that cabin in the mountains, run down, mocked, dismissed as worthless by men who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, held the only treasure that mattered, the truth that set me free, the evidence that brought down an empire, the chance to be the Parker who finally said, enough. They called me useless at the will reading, laughing at my pathetic inheritance while they counted their millions. But usefulness, like wealth, comes in many forms. And sometimes the most useless gift becomes the most valuable inheritance, not for what it's worth, but for what it allows you to become. I became the teacher who practiced what he preached, the son who chose strangers' lives over family lies, the Parker who broke the chain. And in that rundown cabin in the mountains, surrounded by evidence of crimes I didn't commit but couldn't ignore, I found something worth more than $150 million. The freedom that comes from doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. Especially then. The Adirondacks are beautiful in winter. All white silence and crystal air. From the cabin porch, you can see for miles mountains and forests and lakes that existed long before the Parkers and will exist long after our name is forgotten. There's perspective in that vastness. A reminder that our human dramas are temporary, but our choices echo through generations. Helen came up last weekend, bringing supplies and student essays she insisted on grading by the fire. We talked about the future, marriage, kids, the life we could build on the ashes of the one I'd burned down. Do you want children? She asked, practical as always. I do, I said, but I worry about the name. What legacy am I leaving them? The Parker name is poison now. Names are just words, she said. Actions are what matter. Your kids will know you as the Parker who stood up, not the ones who knelt to greed. That's a legacy worth inheriting. She's right, of course. Helen usually is. But still, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just burned everything. Let my father and Rick have their millions and their crimes. Stayed the disappointing son who'd walked away rather than becoming the devastating son who'd brought them down. You'd have hated yourself, Helen said when I voiced this. Every time you stood in front of a class talking about courage, you'd have known you were a coward. That would have poisoned your teaching, your relationships, your entire life. You made the only choice that let you remain who you are. Who am I, though? The hero of this story, or just another player in a tragedy? You're Benjamin Parker, she said simply. A teacher who had the chance to stop evil and took it. Everything else is just noise. Next month marks 3 years since that reading. 3 years since I sat in that Manhattan law office and inherited what everyone thought was nothing but turned out to be everything. The cabin's deed hangs framed in my classroom now, a reminder that value isn't always visible, that the most important inheritances can't be deposited in banks. My father is dead, my brother in prison, the Parker empire reduced to cautionary tales in business schools. But I'm still teaching, still trying to shape young minds toward justice and compassion. Still living my small life that my father called useless but which has meaning in ways his never did. Students sometimes Google me now, find the connection to the scandal. They come to me with wide eyes and careful questions. Is it true? Did you really bring down Parker Industries? I revealed the truth. I correct. They brought themselves down through their choices. I just stopped letting those choices hide in darkness. But they were your family. Yes, and that made it harder, not easier. But family isn't a license to enable evil. Love sometimes means saying no even when, especially when, it costs you everything. One student, sharp kid named Marcus who reminds me of myself at that age, stayed after class last week. My family wants me to join the business, he said. Real estate. But I know they're slumlords. Know they exploit people. And they expect me to just continue it. What do you want to do? Teach. Like you. But they'll cut me off. Say I'm betraying everything they built. I thought about that scared 22-year-old who'd sat across from Grandpa Ted and admitted he couldn't join Parker Industries. Thought about the years of estrangement, the bitter words, the bridges burned. Betraying exploitation isn't betrayal, I told Marcus. It's evolution. And yes, they might cut you off. But you can't build a clean life on a dirty foundation. Better to start fresh with nothing than inherit everything and lose yourself. He nodded, still uncertain but perhaps a little less alone. That's all we can do, really. Light small candles in the darkness and hope they spread. The book comes out next week. Small press run, probably won't make waves beyond academic circles. But Rick knows about it. His latest letter was different from the others, less rage, more confusion, pain. Benjamin, I heard about your book. Another knife in the back, I suppose. Haven't you done enough? You destroyed everything, sent me to this hell, killed Dad. What more do you want? I've had time to think in here. Too much time. And sometimes, late at night when the noise dies down, I wonder if you were right. If what I did. But then morning comes and I remember that you betrayed us. You chose strangers over blood. I'll never forgive you for that. But sometimes I wonder if you'll forgive me for the things in those files. For the choices I made. For the man I became. Probably not. Heroes don't forgive villains, do they? And you're the hero of this story. Everyone says so. 20 more years of this. 20 more years to think about every signature, every deal, every life we destroyed for profit. You gave me that time to think. I hate you for it, but maybe that's what I deserved. Rick, it's the closest he's come to remorse. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. A crack in the armor of his arrogance. Maybe 20 years will be enough to find his conscience. Maybe not. Either way, he'll have the time to look for it. I wrote back for the first time. Rick, I don't want anything more. It's done. The empire is ashes, the victims have whatever justice the system could give them, and we're all living with the consequences of our choices. I'm not the hero of this story. There are no heroes here, just people who made choices and have to live with them. I chose to stop enabling evil. You chose to embrace it. Dad chose to perfect it. Those choices led us here. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. That belongs to the people whose lives you destroyed. But for what it's worth, I hope you find something in those 20 years besides hate. Hope you figure out who Rick Parker could have been if he hadn't been raised to be a monster. I'm teaching still. Living small but living clean. The cabin Grandpa left me has a good view of the mountains. Sometimes I sit on the porch and think about different choices, different lives, different endings to our story. But this is the ending we wrote with our choices. All we can do now is decide what comes next. Benjamin. I don't know if he'll write back. Don't know if it matters. But Helen says any communication is progress, that maybe there's hope for redemption even in maximum security. The cabin is quiet tonight. I'm grading papers on the American Revolution, reading teenage thoughts on when rebellion becomes necessary, when loyalty becomes complicity. Their insights are sharper than they know, their idealism both heartbreaking and hopeful. One student wrote, "Sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is betraying a corrupt system. Sometimes the only way to save something is to destroy it and build better from the ruins." I gave her an A. Tomorrow I'll drive back to Burlington, back to my classroom and my small apartment and my life that fits me like comfortable clothes. I'll teach about choices and consequences, about moral courage and its costs. I'll try to prepare young minds for the moment when they'll have to choose between comfort and conscience, between family and justice, between who they're expected to be and who they need to become. And if they ask, when they ask, if it's worth it, I'll tell them the truth. Yes, it's worth the estrangement, the poverty, the sleepless nights, worth the letters from prison and the death of tyrants, worth every lost dollar and every found principle. Because in the end, we are not our names or our inheritances or our family's expectations. We are our choices, accumulated over time like compound interest, building toward either integrity or emptiness. I chose integrity, chose to be the Benjamin Parker who could face his students without shame, who could love without reservation, who could sleep without the weight of uncounted victims on his conscience. The cabin, that useless inheritance that my father and brother mocked, gave me all of that, gave me the evidence that set the truth free, gave me the choice that defined my life, gave me the chance to be the first Parker in 4 generations to value justice over profit. Grandpa Ted knew what he was doing, knew that the grandson who'd walked away from millions at 22 would have the strength to do what was right at 36. Knew that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what makes you rich but what makes you free. The fire's dying now, embers glowing like the last remnants of the Parker Empire. I'll bank it for the night, make sure it's safe, then head to bed. Tomorrow's a teaching day, and I have young minds to shape, young hearts to encourage toward courage. But tonight, I sit in the cabin my grandfather left me and feel grateful. Grateful for the choice, even though it hurt. Grateful for the truth, even though it burned. Grateful for the chance to be the Parker who finally said enough. They thought I inherited nothing. I inherited everything that mattered. And that makes all the difference. In the morning, I'll close up the cabin and drive home. But I'll be back. This place has become my anchor, my reminder of who I am and why I chose as I did. Helen jokes that I should add a plaque. Here Benjamin Parker found the evidence that brought down an empire and the courage to use it. But I don't need a plaque. Don't need recognition or validation or even understanding from anyone but myself. Because I know what happened here. Know that in this rundown cabin that everyone dismissed as worthless, I found the most valuable thing any Parker ever possessed. the truth. And the truth, as they say, set me free. Free from the weight of complicity. Free from the chain of corruption. Free from the expectation that blood means blindness. Free to teach, to love, to live with integrity. Free to be Benjamin Parker, teacher and truth-teller. The useless grandson who proved more useful than anyone imagined. That's my inheritance. That's my legacy. That's the story I'll tell my children when they're old enough to understand that sometimes the greatest wealth is what you're willing to walk away from. And the greatest inheritance is the chance to choose differently. The Parker name is ruined now, synonymous with greed and corruption and the spectacular fall that comes from flying too close to the sun on wings made of other people's suffering. But maybe, just maybe, it can mean something else too. Maybe it can mean the courage to stand against your own. The wisdom to see that wealth without worth is poverty. The strength to choose justice over generational privilege. Maybe the Parker name, burned down to its foundations, can be rebuilt into something better. Not an empire of exploitation, but a legacy of education. Not power over others, but empowerment of others. That's what I'm trying to build now, one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one choice at a time. The smaller than what my family built. Quieter. Less impressive on paper. But it's honest. It's helpful. It's healing instead of harming. And in the end, that's the only inheritance worth leaving. A world a little better than you found it. A truth told when lying would be easier. A chain of corruption broken by one person willing to pay the price. They laughed at me for inheriting just a cabin. But that cabin contained the power to change everything. And I used it. That's the Parker legacy now. Not the billions built on blood, but the teacher who bled to stop the building. Not the empire that rose through exploitation, but the grandson who brought it down through exposure. Not the useless inheritance they mocked, but the priceless chance to do what was right. I'll take that legacy. I'll teach that legacy. I'll live that legacy until my last breath. And maybe, somewhere in whatever comes after this life, Theodore Parker is finally at peace, knowing that one of his grandsons, at least, learned the only lesson that really mattered. That some prices are too high to pay even for an empire. That some chains must be broken, even if you're the one wearing them. That some cabins contain treasures beyond measure, if you just know where to look. Thank you for listening to my story. If you're like me, someone who spent years trying to earn love that was never truly offered, you know these aren't just stories. They're mirrors of our deepest wounds and greatest triumphs. Subscribe if these stories resonate with your journey. Hit that notification bell. Think of it as our regular meetup, where we share truths that others might not understand. And please, leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? What would you have done in my shoes? Your words matter to me, and they matter to everyone here who's walked this lonely path. Tomorrow, I'll be back with another story. Until then, remember, family isn't always blood, and sometimes the greatest gift is discovering who you truly are. Take care of yourself. You deserve it.